Well, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to this evening's Grand Canyon Historical Society virtual outing. We have a very fine presentation this evening that I've been looking forward to learning about and hearing Cindy present. We're going to have Cindy Stafford, who is an author, historian, and many other endeavors and very other avocations. She will speak about Leo Weaver, Grand Canyon, and the 1940 Coronado Cuarto Centennial. Let's get back. There we go. So the Grand Canyon Historical Society celebrates and promotes the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. We are celebrating our 40 years of making history as a historical society this year. So if you like what you see this evening, if you like to support what we do, please consider becoming a member if you aren't already a member. And the membership dues are only $35 per year. This is an all-volunteer organization, so all those dues go to work to support our activities, our web presence, our videos, our scholarships, our research grants. We have the link here for joining. You can pay online. It's a very simple way to use your credit or debit card to become immediately a member of the organization. In addition to these online events, we have 4 times per year historical journal. It's the Old Pioneer, which also includes our activities bulletin, which is towards the end of the publication. It comes out both in print and digital form. The digital form comes out about 2 weeks before you receive the print form in the mail. And you'll see several authors, noteworthy authors, who are experts on Grand Canyon, the Southwest, other national monuments, national parks, and national recreation areas that surround northern Arizona, southern Utah, southern Nevada, and the Four Corners area. So these virtual outings, all of the videos can be found at the website. Here is the link. This is being recorded, so if you don't write down the link here, you can just go to the Vimeo, which I will post at the website probably within 24 hours of this webinar. It will be there, and then you can just pick it up right from the video recording. So oral histories, we do conduct oral histories as well as these virtual outings. This is for those who have a story to share about the history of Grand Canyon and the surrounding region. Here I am actually interviewing Don Ranney, who's the father of Wayne Ranney. Don was a trainee with the predecessor to the FAA, which is called the CAA, Civil Aeronautics Administration. In the mid-50s, actually in June 1956, he was off-site at the LA airport. And that was, of course, when 2 airliners, which are not the ones in the photo here, this is a stock photo, but 2 airliners crashed over the area at the confluence of the Little Colorado and the Colorado River. This photo on the right, the photo on the right shows the crash sites, which are beyond the watchtower. So if you know anyone who would like to participate or who have a history to share with everyone else in our society and with the public, please go ahead and submit those, or just send us an email, and we'll try to schedule an oral history interview. All the oral history interviews, the vast majority of them are online at this link, which is, again, our website is grandcanyonhistory.org, and that opens up our all of the resources at our website. So also, if you want to be part of this virtual outing program, which is typically the second Tuesday of each month, we try to do at least 11 per year. Or if you have an idea for a physical outing, we had a physical outing at the Apex historical site in Tucson about 2 months ago. Please let us know. Contact us, and we've hosted guest outings many times. We had Shane Murphy conduct a walking tour of the John Hance sites along some of the trails from the rim. So we try to accommodate all kinds of historical events, historical outings that again promote our mission statement. So here are the coming attractions. I'm actually going to be the speaker next month, and it's going to be the third Tuesday in this case because there's another event on the Tuesday the 10th that's of civic interest to many people. It'll be the presidential debates, so we're scheduling it for the 17th, and I'm going to expand on the paper I gave at the symposium last November, and I'm going to be speaking about a subgroup of passengers on the United flight, all of whom perished at Char Butte on June 30, 1956. These people are part of Grand Canyon history as anyone else is. So it's a very special and very meaningful endeavor for me to research these people and to share with you some very interesting confluence points or points of commonality and interest that I believe hopefully you'll find interesting as well. I'm not going to read my bio. You can read that online when we post this coming attraction. So tonight, without any further ado, we have Cindy Stafford. So Cindy worked as a speech therapist in New Mexico, Utah, and now in Page, Arizona. Hiking with her husband, Kern Nuttall, led to a passion for canyon country, landscape, and history. 10 seasons as an interpretive ranger for Glen Canyon followed. And Cindy, I believe it's Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. Is that it?
Correct.
Anyway, yes. In 2015, she published a Grand Canyon cemetery map and provided research for Kern's book, In a Better Place, Cemeteries and Grave Sites of Grand Canyon, which was published in 2016. I'm proud to have a signed copy of it from Kern. It's on my Grand Canyon bookshelf here at my desk. She also volunteers in the museum collection at Glen Canyon. So, without any further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and turn the screen and turn the Zoom call over to Cindy.
Okay.
So Cindy, take it away. You just have to hit your Zoom. Since you're a co-host, you just hit the Zoom, the share button, and away you go. And I'm going to mute so that you're the only person whose sounds comes through.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. As Coconino County Secretary for the Coronado Cuarto Centennial, Leo Weaver had grandiose plans culminating at Grand Canyon in September 1940. We're going to explore these best laid plans, Leo's connection to the Grand Canyon area, and the park's participation, and then we'll review Coronado's 1540 expedition and how he learned about the cities of Cibola. And we'll look at his sidekick Cardenas's trek to the Grand Canyon. We'll also review what was left out of that celebration. Historian P.T. Riley says that Leo had the natural ability to promote the rosy side of anything and stir enthusiasm in his listeners. Navajos called him Mr. Big Hat for obvious reasons, and he was a bit of a Hollywood cowboy. He loved Western clothes. And we learned in the most recent Old Pioneer, if you got that Coronado Butte in the background was previously named Ayers Peak. And the Centennial stamp was, this is the one that was released that year. But our story begins at the Hotel Monte Vista in Flagstaff, where Leo was manager for a year or two. Two significant encounters happened here. The first one is that Leo recognized the waitress Hazel Barbeau from when she worked at El Tovar as a Harvey girl. Hazel fell for this charming guy. He was a widower, 14 years older, and he had a 14-year-old daughter. And Hazel is on the right side of the photograph, and daughter Billy is on the left, Leo in the middle. Billy also became a Harvey girl.
Now they're ready to lose their second one in a row to the Dodgers.
Just please, everyone, mute their phones as much as possible so we don't have any interrupting sounds. Thank you.
Yeah, that's all right. So Billy became a Harvey girl as well in a few more years and worked at the Grand Canyon. And after she went into nursing school and completed her training, she worked as a nurse at the Grand Canyon. She ended up marrying a trail guide from there. And Hazel said that Leo did not like straight edges on his photographs. So none of the photos in their album have straight edges. He would tear them in a, I guess, artistic fashion. So that's why this one looks torn on the edges. I also like that the Hotel Monte Vista on the lower left touted themselves as the jumping off point for places as far-flung as Rainbow Bridge National Monument, which was 200 miles away, and it would require at least 2 days by horseback trip to see Rainbow Bridge. Well, Leo took Hazel on a 2-week honeymoon, the circuit, traveling the trading post circuit, and they did stay at the Rainbow Lodge for a few nights. I tried to find where they had signed into Rainbow Bridge, but they didn't. Their names do not appear in the register during the dates that they were there. This was the end of October in 1931. The second important encounter that Leo had at the Hotel Monte Vista was with Charles H. Spencer, and that's where he heard tales about Lee's Ferry from Charlie Spencer. He's a tireless, and some would say tiresome, promoter of the mining and water projects at the Lee's Ferry area. And if you don't know who Charles Spencer was, you might want to check out some of the Lee's Ferry history written about him in P.T. Riley's book on Lee's Ferry. But Leo decided to take a look at the Lonely Dell Ranch, and dreams of a new winter guest ranch at what he considered a better location than his guest ranch in Wickenburg took root, despite the Great Depression, depressed travel, except for wealthy clients, and those pesky things called mortgages. He named it Paradise Canyon even before he managed to buy it. And Lonely Dell is located along the Paria River at Lee's Ferry, and it's right in the floodplain. It's upstream from Grand Canyon in what's now Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, and it's close to the Vermilion Cliffs National Monument, which you can see in the background. Leo envisioned a guest ranch where visitors could go on horseback rides and participate in taking care of the animals and get a break from city life in a very scenic setting. And Leo is credited with starting the first modern guest ranch trend in Arizona. Lonely Dell is also the setting for Zane Grey's book, Heritage of the Desert. He called it the Oasis in that book. At that time, there were cabins and other buildings that are not there today, but Leo built a lodge in the mid-1930s. It's called the Weaver Ranch House today, and Polly Hungavi on the right side was the main stonemason. Other Hopi workers and families lived and worked there as well. And the park website says that the house lacked electricity, running water, and returning guests. It was really hard to charge enough to cover expenses, and there were not that many guests. But those who came were extremely loyal to Leo and to the place. It had a very comfortable interior. Leo made some of the furniture and some from driftwood that had come down the Colorado River that he collected. And you can see a lot of the Navajo rugs and the Western decor. He entertained his guests singing and playing the piano. Sometimes they would gather around the piano and sing in the evenings. He wrote music. He tuned his own piano. He had been in vaudeville in Australia, and he'd had bit parts in Hollywood movies. So he was used to entertaining people. Hazel and Leo took guests on hikes and picnics and trail rides, pack trips, car trips, horseback rides, and trail rides. He recruited at the El Tovar Hotel for guests to come down to Paradise Canyon, and he was well known at the Grand Canyon. Guide and former cowboy Ed Fisher on the left and daughter Billy took guests on 10-day pack trips to the Crossing of the Fathers area that's upstream in Glen Canyon. Leo loved Arabian horses, and he had some favorites. He paid $1,000 for 2 colts, even when bills were piling up. Hazel said that his idea of taking care of bills was to toss them in file 13. He ordered Professor Beery's book, and he tried to train his horses with somewhat mixed and frustrating results. One of his favorite horses got caught in a fence and injured his leg, so he could not be ridden for several months. In the middle photograph is Leo on the left and Preacher Shine Smith on the right, and Preacher helped him with his horses and some work on the ranch. The top photo is supposed to be Leo, but I don't know that that really looks very much like him with his Arabian horse El Makadam. The Flying Circle W was Leo's registered brand and the name of his other ranches. And here it's on his Cowhide guest book. These are from the P.T. Riley collection at the Klein Library. Disney cartoonist Joe Grant stayed there, and he apparently drew this sketch of a little fawn that Leo had as a pet at his Flagstaff ranch called Bucky. And this, I'm told, became the inspiration for Bambi. Joe signed the guest book with sincere appreciation for a delightful vacation, thanks to Leo, Hazel, and Billy. One of Leo and Hazel's loyal returning guests and friend was British medieval historian, author, broadcaster Rhoda Power. She liked to interpret medieval history for children with books like this one, Redcap Runs Away. She gave Leo quite a bit of money to try to save the ranch from foreclosure, but it was not enough. And she signed into the guest book and said, "If I can ever do for Hazel and Leo 1/4 of what they have done for me, I shall feel that I have not lived in vain. I shall never be far away because my heart will always be in Paradise Canyon." And she put the dates that she had stayed there, several months in all. Despite the money that Rhoda had helped them with, the couple still had to seek outside work to try and keep afloat. In the upper left is the Adams Hotel in Phoenix, and that's where Hazel worked one winter until Rhoda was able to secure a $1,000 loan from a friend for them. And then Leo worked one winter at the Biltmore Hotel in Phoenix, and he organized writing and guest activities, and he would try to recruit some of the guests to his ranch as well. And in the winter of 1938, Leo helped organize and promote the Phoenix Rodeo. One problem that Leo encountered were the high costs of feed for his livestock. And he was not able to raise his own alfalfa because every attempt he had to dam the Paria River ended in failure. A string of bad luck, like we mentioned, the horse and the bad leg. A windstorm brought down a cottonwood limb on top of his new truck and crushed the bed. And then one night he was sitting in the Ramada and bitten on the foot by a rattlesnake. And only a frantic car ride and a week in the hospital in Flagstaff saved his life. So these discouragements, plus not enough guests, really contributed to Leo losing the ranch. And so when the offer of a job with the Flagstaff Chamber of Commerce came through, another phase of his life began. And that's how Leo became involved with the Cuarto Centennial celebration. In 1935, Congress designated the Coronado Cuarto Centennial Commission. And 4 years later, it took 4 years, but Arizona got on board. This actually encompassed about 7 states, but I'm going to focus mostly on New Mexico and Arizona. FDR said, take an army of Civilian Conservation Corps young men or National Youth Administration boys and march them over the road which Coronado traveled. And as we'll see, that was a lot easier said than done. Now we'll go back 400 years earlier and get some background on the original Coronado expedition and how he learned about these fabled cities of Cibola. What became the United States was first entered by Europeans in Florida, almost 100 years before the Puritans and the merchants in Massachusetts. And we're going to be interested in the lives of 2 survivors out of only 4, out of 600 individuals that were on the Navarez expedition in Florida. And Cabeza de Vaca is the first one we're going to talk about. He and these others who survived 8 years to get back to Mexico City from Florida, and they went up to 10,000 miles. That included several years when they were enslaved by natives along the coast. They endured hurricanes, shipwrecks, handmade rafts across the Gulf of Mexico, and they were the first known non-Native Americans to see the Mississippi River and across the Gulf of Mexico and Texas and encounter the native tribes. And some of those tribal names are on this map. He wrote a book, and he's the only survivor to record the names and practices of the tribes. He wrote the first description of the 7 cities of Cibola, and that was the term that was used for what we call bison. They called them humpbacked cattle, and he did record all these native tribes and some documentation of the trip. The second survivor became the guide for Fray Marcos de Niza's upcoming expedition to check out these 7 cities of Cibola. And his name was Esteban de Dorantes. He was a Moroccan slave, but he was very intelligent, a quick learner. He had learned some of the native languages, and he was able to pass himself off as a healer, an interpreter, a go-between, and a son of the sun. You can see in the sketch that he apparently had some greyhounds, and he used artifacts that other tribes had given him, and he was able to be a very charismatic guy. So unfortunately, though, it did not end very well for either Esteban or Fray Marcos de Niza. But first, this is the route that historians think they may have taken from Mexico, what is New Spain, up to Cibola, which is Zuni. And it's very difficult for historians to tell exactly because the names of the rivers are different and the landscape descriptions aren't always easy to pin down. For example, the native tribe village that starts with CHICH, that's never been figured out which tribe that was. But Cibola, we know, is Zuni. So when Esteban got outside the village of Zuni, he was met there, put up outside. He said, "I'm coming to establish peace and to heal you. And by the way, give me your women and your turquoise." So that didn't go over that well with the Zuni, and they had a prophecy that a white man will come and instruct you in divine matters. But the village elders were very suspicious of Esteban's claims that he came from a land of white men because he was dark-skinned. And they resented his demands for turquoise and women, and they killed him when he attempted to enter the village after they had told him, "Don't come in." So a few miles away, after hearing these reports and seeing Esteban's bloodied clothing, Fray Marcos de Niza made a hasty retreat after erecting a cross and claiming the territory for Spain. But Esteban's death foreshadowed the violence of the Spanish conquest and colonization, and some say that Black Cachina derives from Esteban, and others say no, it was always part of the the Zuni pantheon, Chekwana. Fray Marcos de Niza returned to Mexico City with these outlandish stories about the 7 cities of gold, and he had renamed them San Francisco. He told them Cibola, or San Francisco, is as big as Mexico City, and he said that the buildings were encrusted with precious stones and that the inhabitants used gold and silver tableware. But in his book, he did describe the landscape, the people, the culture, the desert terrain, and all the challenges. And it's an important historical document because it provides insight into the early exploration of the American Southwest and the interactions between explorers and the tribes. And it sheds light on the myths and legends that inspired the treks in search of the wealth and glory. Most consider that inscription in the background to be a fake. It's in Pima Canyon near Phoenix. It translates Fray Marcos de Niza crowned all of New Mexico at his expense in the year 1539. And of course, at the time, there was no New Mexico, there was no Mexico, and it was not at his expense. But in February 1540, Fray Marcos de Niza led Coronado back to the area with 400 Spaniards, More than 1,000 Mexican Indians, 4 Franciscan friars, slaves, family members, servants, and livestock. And it became obvious soon that the descriptions of fine Southwest landscape were false, or at least exaggerated. The chronicler later recorded, "The curses that some hurled at Fray Marcos were such that God forbid they may befall him." De Niza had to return to Mexico City in shame. And Coronado's orders had 2 very strict injunctions. One, he was to show the greatest regard for the Aztecs that were accompanying him. They worked as wranglers, camp assistants, cooks, grooms, servants, and foot soldiers. And 2, even more important, he was to show every consideration, kindness, and forbearance to natives of Cibola and to any other settlements that he would encounter. The best definition I've found for entrada is an incursion or entry into and direct reconnaissance of new territory by a European-led expeditionary group or force. And of course, it's the name for that beautiful Jurassic sandstone that we have a little north of the Grand Canyon in the area I'm from near Page and the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. So we don't know on the lower right map exactly where Coronado crossed into what would become Arizona in more than 300 years. But most people think it was probably up the San Pedro River, maybe the Santa Cruz River, or other historians argue that it could have been closer to the New Mexico border. And then over on the map on the left, they were supposed to, it's very important to historians that they identify the exact location because there was some money to put a Coronado National Memorial there at the border. And it's not known exactly where that is. So we don't know the exact location. And then, of course, at the Grand Canyon, it is not known exactly where that expedition arrived at the Grand Canyon. But at Zuni, basically, Coronado said, "You should all become Christians and accept the true God as Lord and His Majesty as your King and earthly master." And that would be Charles V, shown on the left. He said, "We're coming to defend you in the name of our Lord, the Emperor." The interpreter said, basically, "Submit to His Majesty and to God." And the mantra of the conquistador was basically, "We came here to serve God and also to get rich." And I would add, not necessarily in that order. Remember, this would be the first time the Zuni had seen horses, not to mention Europeans wearing armor and firing guns. The Zuni response, maybe predictably, was a shower of arrows, and then the Spanish counterattacked and killed several Zuni. The Zuni were overpowered and forced to evacuate. And so began this very dramatic cultural and biological exchange, this irrevocable change in the lives and cultures of the indigenous peoples of the region, some who had lived here for centuries, this huge cultural collapse, and eventually some sort of fusion, the result which you can still see today. A few weeks later, Coronado had to write to his sponsor and the governor, Viceroy Mendoza. And he tried to put the best spin on it, and he downplayed the violence and the killing, which went against his instructions. He said, "The hunger which we suffered would not permit of any delay. And as far as I can judge, it doesn't appear to me that there's any hope of getting gold or silver. And this is a very small rocky pueblo, and a lot of farm settlements back in New Spain look better. But they did get something that they valued more than gold and silver, and that was the food from the Zuni gardens. And they described large chickens, which were probably turkeys. So the starving Spaniards ate well, better than they had in a while. Their journey had taken 4 months. It was about 1,650 miles, and they averaged about 14 miles a day. And the future explorations over the next couple years took Coronado as far as Kansas. And they covered thousands of miles of Southwest territory, and historians love to point out that that was a lot more than the Pilgrims. But they were sacking and looting native villages along the way, and what they didn't destroy, the microbes took care of. In the spring of 1542, Coronado returned to New Spain. 2 years later, he was indicted on hundreds of counts, and he was jailed near Mexico City. He was found guilty of negligence. He was fined 600 gold pesos and trial expenses. So he retired. He was sick for a couple of years, and he died at age 44. But for our purposes, what's kind of important is that he sent his sidekick, Don Lopez de Cardenas, to the Grand Canyon region. First, Captain Pedro de Tovar had been to what they called Tusayan, which are the Hopi villages, and he was told of this great river to the west. So Cardenas had about 12 soldiers with him. They say they went 50 leagues toward the west. Maybe that's 130 miles. Some think the Hopi guides were leading them a little bit astray or maybe in circles. It took about 20 days. They said that the opposite rim looked 3 or 4 leagues away by air, and that for 3 days they tried to get to the river, not successfully. But you'll be happy to know that in 1939, officials thought they had selected the exact spot where Lopez de Cardenas and his party of men first gazed upon the mighty gorge, and attempting to descend it were driven back by thirst. Here's part of that group. I can just hear Leo say, and it was an event 400 years in the making. We have Superintendent Bryant in the middle, Superintendent of Grand Canyon, and then Mr. Big Hat is standing next to him. They called it Discovery Point. Here's the larger group, and you'll recognize some Grand Canyon names and Flagstaff names like Reardon, Kennedy, Midgley. Mary Boyer in the center, the only woman. I at first was so hoping and thought that was Grace Sparks. She was the secretary for the Chamber of Commerce in Prescott and involved in a lot of events throughout the years. To the right of her, from our direction, is Victor Petroso. He was the manager of El Tovar and a big Fred Harvey person at the Grand Canyon. And then Superintendent Bryan, again, he's bowing his head, his hat's off. It looks like he's praying to me. I think when I see this picture, he's saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Leo shows up at the Hotel Monte Vista. He's giving a talk for the Rotary Club, and he's unveiling his operating plan, he calls it. He says it's more staggering than ever. It's going to be the most spectacular offering ever presented in the Southwest, and that the greatest concern will be accommodating the thousands of visitors throughout the year who are going to be coming. He's planning to retrace Cardenas's expedition from Zuni to the Grand Canyon. He's going to have 100 horsemen with cattle and sheep, and Zuni guides to Walpi and Hopi guides to the Grand Canyon. So this is 240 miles of desert travel in the summertime. He's hoping to have a color movie and maybe daily shortwave radio broadcasts. He wants to have a battle reenacted between the Navajo and the Spanish at Ganado. Well, FDR and the federal government had given $75,000 for 3 pageants that were going to be held at Nogales, Yuma, and the Grand Canyon in Arizona. But I think the fact that the indigestion ad is on this page with these grandiose plans is maybe metaphorical. So in the schematic of Arizona, the blue line would represent the route that Leo's proposed expedition would take, and Zuni Pueblo is just to the right in New Mexico off this map. He would go up towards Keams Canyon onto the Hopi mesas and then descend up to Cameron and onto the Grand Canyon. And his proposed budget, itemized, would be a whopping $29,000, and in today's dollars, that would be about $650,000, which I think is why this part of the pageant, the reenactment stuff never happened. But one expedition that did happen was trying to retrace Coronado's exact route, and that included historians like Herbert Bolton, you may have recognized, written some books, and Park Service people. And federal money had been given, $10,000 for the Centennial Monument to be erected on that spot in Arizona where Coronado came in. And they did determine, probably not in the exact location, but Grace Sparks is the one who was the first superintendent of the Coronado National Memorial. And it is the spot where the Arizona Trail boundary is between Arizona and Mexico. There was going to be a goodwill mission that would leave in January to go to Mexico, and they were going to request that the Mexican government participate and that they have 75 descendants of members of Coronado's expedition retrace his route. And they were leaving, by the way, they were leaving from the Coronado Museum historical site, and that's Bernalillo, New Mexico, just north of Albuquerque. That's where Coronado spent the winter, he and his army, the first year. But this expedition revealed some startling facts. It was about 4,000 miles of almost impassable roads, and they found not a lot of information about Coronado, and many residents hadn't heard of him. And of course, they couldn't determine the actual point of entry. It wasn't known or even researched, maybe somewhere near Naco. And again, the historians are pulling their hair out because they feel like it's such a significant Plymouth Rock thing in the Southwest and 80 years before the Pilgrims. We can see that there were 2 or more problems. Even as recently as 2022, the analysis was, though professional archaeologists and amateur sleuths had puzzled for close to 150 years, Coronado's exact route through Arizona to the Zuni Pueblos remains a mystery. And the exact South Rim location that Cardenas arrived at is not known. The Mexican public was demanding Coronado be excluded from their history books. Therefore, an invitation to celebrate the imposition of foreign domination didn't have much interest for them. And the arrival of the Spanish Christian civilization began this process of pillage, plunder, and slavery. But the show must go on, right? So the Coronado Smile Girl on the left is the smile that the New Mexico State Police are going to greet visitors to their state with. And then in the center, Charlie McCarthy and Edgar Bergen are wearing the Coronado tie. It says that these were made in Albuquerque by native Spanish Americans. They are hand-loomed and handmade, the snappiest tie on the market today. I tried to find a better photograph of the tie and I couldn't. And then on the right, they're talking about the 6-month party that's going to be happening. In the fine print, it says that the swashbuckling Coronado and his conquistadors wintered on their first trip near Bernalillo. And after a good look at the Indians, Zuni, Apache, Navajo, and Hopi, I think it was a lot more than a good look since he was killing a lot of people. He set out to find the source of gold heralded in the fabled 7 cities of Cibola. And up in the upper right, they do make mention of the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, and we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. This mass tellings must precede mass sellings, I guess, was a recurring article in the newspapers of Arizona. They were really touting this Rediscover Arizona campaign, and they're saying that American tourists have $6 billion to spend and the depressing effects of war have lifted. And this is August 1940, so September 1st, 1939 is when Hitler had marched into Poland and the United Kingdom and France had declared war on Germany. So I'm not sure the war has really lifted, but they're predicting a great travel season and that you can retrace Coronado's journey in comfort and safety and succeed where Coronado failed. That part's probably true. And that you should insist your elected officials do their part. Well, the pageant was going to be at the Grand Canyon just in a month, but I guess there were celebrations throughout the next year in Arizona and definitely for a couple more years, even as far away as Kansas. So at the canyon, the celebration was about the first weekend in September, 12 miles from El Tovar at sundown, probably near Desert View Tower. And you could see real Indians that excite the average American. They list the groups, authentic costumes, and a tent city for visitors. And a lot of these museum collection photographs aren't labeled with the exact people who were participants, but the CCC enrollees are on the left, and on the right, Chief Ranger Perry is labeled. 1,500 people attended this event, and the purpose, they said, was to reenact the pageant and recognize important Spanish cultural contributions. They dedicated it to the explorers, the padres, and the settlers, but left out some important groups. And they said in this article I read it was as historically accurate as known. And one has to wonder if the historians who delve deeply into Spanish history in the Southwest had to have known about the other side of that story. I tried to find the pageant wording, and I was not able to find that. And then, of course, there were some Spanish and Hopi dances to round out the event. There are 6 slides, I think, that are photographs from the museum collection, and I want to show those even though I don't have a lot of information about them. A lot of them are not labeled, so if people would recognize anyone, they should let Colleen or Kim at the museum know. On the left is a CCC enrollee, and right is identified as Ranger Miller. These folks are not identified. But they are kind of dramatic photos. On the right, we can see the Bright Angel Lodge and Victor Petroso and his staff. So I'm thinking that these folks were probably workers at either Bright Angel Lodge or El Tovar, Fred Harvey employees at any rate. On the left is Ranger Barnett. When I look at that wistful gaze, I think he's thinking, get me out of here. And in the center is someone identified as Harold Hall. There is someone who worked for the Grand Canyon for the National Park called Hilliard Hall. He was the sanitation inspector, and he's buried at the Grand Canyon Cemetery. He died the following year at a drowning at Howard Lake when he was in a fishing boat. But this is identified Harold Hall, and I wonder if that's Hilliard. I read in an article that Hilliard Hall did participate. And on the right are some Mexican hat dancers. I don't have any information about where they came from, if they lived locally, or if indeed they did recruit them from Mexico. After the event, Leo and Hazel moved to New Mexico, where he worked for the U.S. Highway 66 Association, and he was proposing a 7-state organization for that group. And then they moved back to Arizona eventually. He died in 1951. He was 64 years old, died in Tucson of lung cancer. He was like the Marlboro cowboy. He was never without a cigarette. He would not have liked that term dude because he called his places guest ranches and referred to his clients as guests, not dudes. He thought that would be very disrespectful and didn't like that name for them. His body was flown to Flagstaff. He's buried in the Calvary Cemetery. He was buried in his Western clothing, even his boots. And 4 of his Navajo and Hopi friends rode horses all the way from Moenkopi to attend the services, and that was about 75 miles. So for more honesty in looking at history, Irene Kearns, who works for the Smithsonian in education, says we need to ask ourselves, where are the narratives missing or untold or wrong? Oh, I want to go back to that. She says that scholarship has shifted over the last several decades, that we have new understandings of genocide and settler colonialism, and that displaces those previous narratives. Stephen Aaron, who's a historian, says the focus is now more on the cultural, the ecological, and the demographic costs of conquest and colonization, and that we now see the West more in a multicultural or multi-ethnic lens. I would add that we are also recognizing and calling out some of that romanticized history and the mythology. One story that's not told often enough is the Pueblo Revolt of August 10th, 1680, and it was carried out by Popeye, whose statue now represents New Mexico in the U.S. Capitol. He set a date for the rebellion and sent runners to all the pueblos. They carried knotted cords, and those represented the number of days until the day of the uprising. Each morning, the Pueblo elders would untie one knot on the cord, and when the last knot was revealed, that was the date of the rebellion. They killed the Spanish friars and settlers, and some retreated to El Paso. The mission churches were destroyed. The Spanish did return in 12 years, and the Catholic Church has attempted to apologize a couple times to the Hopi as recently as 2022, and the Hopi in writing have said the apology is not accepted. If you want to know more about this period of history, David Roberts has a good book called The Pueblo Revolt. This event took place almost 100 years before the Revolutionary War. It's been called the first revolution in what would become the United States. And Popeye is credited with saving indigenous cultures from destruction under the encomienda system. That was a feudal system that required or enacted enslavement and forced conversion to Christianity. And when the Spanish returned in 12 years, they did have more tolerance for a mix of indigenous and Catholic traditions, and they dropped that encomienda system. You'll notice that this painting perhaps is painted by Fred Cabote, that great artist who has a lot of works at Desert View Tower and in the Bright Angel Lodge, in the lounge at Bright Angel. And this was painted in 1976, depicting that revolt, and it was for the U.S. bicentennial. There are current events going on right now. Recently in New Mexico, 2 statues of Conquistador Juan de Oñate were taken down. And in 1598, Oñate came to establish a colony, and of course that involved subjugating and Christianizing the indigenous population, as well as extracting all the riches that he could. His soldiers demanded food and blankets from Acoma Pueblo, and native warriors killed 12 of his soldiers. So there was a huge retaliation, and his soldiers slaughtered 800 warriors, women, and children, and they enslaved the remaining 500 survivors. They cut a foot off from 24 young men as a warning to the other rebellious Pueblos, and everyone over the age of 12 had 20 years of forced servitude. In 1606, though, Oñate was put on trial in Mexico City for cruelty to the people at Acoma and to the colonists. And Melanie Yazzie, a historian, says there must be honesty if there's going to be coexistence. As an aside, Oñate is credited with one of the very earliest and the only early dated inscription, 1605, at El Morro National Monument. And it translates, passed by here the governor Don Juan de Oñate, from the discovery of the Sea of the South on the 16th of April, 1605. And one historian commented, you'd think back then they could have found some empty space instead of putting it right over an ancient petroglyph. In 1998, one statue of Oñate had the right foot cut off shortly before the 400th anniversary of the celebration of his arrival. And a note was placed there that said, "Fair is fair." They did recast the foot, and in 2017, the statue's left foot was painted red, and the words "Remember 1680" were painted on the monument's base. The county of Rio Arriba removed the statue in 2020, and during a rally 3 years later celebrating the postponement of installing it in nearby Espanola, New Mexico, one participant was shot, and the 23-year-old suspect was charged with attempted first-degree murder and hate crimes. Unfortunately, the other side of the story is being told and becoming more accessible. There's a lot of books out by and for the story told by a Native point of view. There's a lot of Native scholarship going on. It seems like every time you look, there's more books out about this part of the history. It's becoming, kind of a way of retelling the story and being more inclusive about retelling that history. This is from the Zuni Museum, and this is their sacred mesa, Dawa Yalani, that they retreated to when the Spanish drove them out of their village. And it's not allowed, no one can go there but Zuni. In their museum, they have what I consider one of the more charitable descriptions of what they learned from the Spanish. New religion and language, new construction, a lot of new foods were introduced in the domestic animals, new cooking methods, new forms of government. and that our former ways of living, speaking, thinking, and believing were challenged, and how. And you're probably familiar with the Grand Canyon Intertribal Working Group. It's been meeting since 2015. There are 11 tribal affiliations. And recently the Havasupai Gardens had the name change. I like the original Supai name of Haagua. I think that might be how you pronounce it. I'm not able to even attempt how to say this one other than the ancestral footprints of Grand Canyon, whose first anniversary, I think, was just yesterday. But I did identify some of the people in this photograph, including Governor Katie Hobbs on the left in the red slacks. Next to her in the cowgirl boots is Kristen Sinema, or Senator. And then in the black hat is Navajo Nation President Boo Nygren. He's standing behind President Biden, who's signing the proclamation. And in the red skirt is Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland. And next to her is Arizona Congressman Raul Grijalva. Oscar Wilde reminds us that the one duty we owe to history is to rewrite it. And one of the books I would recommend if you'd like to know more about this part of history in a very readable format is Doug Preston's book called Cities of Gold. And he and a friend in the late 80s set out on horseback to try to retrace Coronado's trek through Arizona and New Mexico to the Pecos Pueblos. It's very readable. Kern and I started reading it just from the Zuni Pueblo part, where I was most interested. He does not mention much about Cardenas and the trek to Grand Canyon because he's retracing it the other way. But it's a great way to make this history more accessible and read about a more modern adventure of trying to retrace his journey. Thanks.